So we've reached a point where we understand balance sheets. We understand how balance sheets tie out to M&A transactions, exit transactions, liquidity events when the owners make their money. We understand how to allocate those net proceeds. We look at the cap table. We understand that the cap table lists ownership percentages, and tied to those ownership percentages are shares. We understand the distinction between common shares and preferred shares. And we know that we're selling preferred shares to investors. And we know what's involved with those preferred shares, the control and governance rights and the economic rights. We also know how to actually calculate how many shares we're selling. What ownership percentage of the company are we transacting when we're raising money? And we do that through these equations here. Pre-money valuation divided by the pre-money total equity, that's a share number, gives us a price per share. The investment amount divided by the price per share gives us the number of shares. We input it on the cap table, we're golden. We also know, we understand that sometimes the parties can't agree on, or at least in the past, they couldn't agree on valuation. So we invented this notion of the convertible promissory note. It started with principal and interest and a maturity date, and evolved to include a discount as well as a cap, which then, of course, brought us back into valuation. And we finished this segment up to this point by saying, well, if we're back to negotiating valuation by virtue of negotiating a cap, why even have a convertible promissory note? Let's just scrap it and sell preferred shares. And that's what a lot of angels do, and a lot of early stage investors do, a lot of seed stage investors do, but many don't. Many still use the convertible promissory note, and they do it because it's a pretty simple instrument, and it works pretty well, and they're accustomed to it. And that's an interesting point, which is to say that there are several factors which drive the structure of the seed deal. Of course, control, governance, economics, ownership, those are the macro factors. But lack of friction, ease of implementation, cost, those are relevant factors too. Which brings us to the final portion of this discussion, which is the third form of seed deal, which is the SAFE. So, preferred shares, deal structure number one. Convertible notes, deal structure number two. Deal structure number three, SAFEs. SAFE is an acronym. Simple agreement for future equity. SAFE. It was invented in 2013 by Y Combinator. Y Combinator is an accelerator in the Bay Area. An accelerator is basically a hothouse for startups. And when startups agree to participate in an accelerator, typically that accelerator will invest in the startup. And what Y Combinator decided or hit upon is they thought, well, we don't want to do preferred shares because we don't want to be hard fixing that valuation right now. We don't want to be negotiating about board seats and protected provisions and whatnot. So we would prefer not to do preferred shares. We could do a convertible note. That obviously is tried and true and works really well. But there are a couple of issues associated with convertible notes. We're not going to go too far down this rabbit hole, but there are some potential tax complications that arise with convertible notes, particularly if you're converting the interest into shares. This frequently happens. There's an argument that that's income to the holder, and they would need to pay tax on that at that moment of conversion, even though they're not getting cash. Putting that aside, it's a tax complication that certainly everyone would sort of prefer to not have to wrestle with. It's complexity. So Y Combinator said, can't we just do away with that? Let's just do away with interest. And then they said, you know, the maturity date, it'd be good to do away with that as well. Whether it's 12 months or 18 months or 24 months or 36 months, the idea is that we're going to give this startup enough breathing room to get from the moment of this investment transaction to the qualified financing. But what frequently happens is it's insufficient time, that the company just doesn't evolve enough to raise the qualified financing, and as a consequence, the note comes due. And in theory, if it hasn't converted yet, we're back to promissory note version 1.0, the company's got to repay it. Well, it doesn't have the cash to repay it. So now what happens? Well, the company has to go to the investor hat in hand and say, hey, we need you to extend the term of the note, which oftentimes happens. Investors get it, but sometimes they don't, and it gives them a chance to renegotiate. Maybe they negotiate a deeper discount. Maybe they negotiate a lower cap. Maybe they negotiate a higher interest rate. It gives them a second bite of the apple. And Y Combinator didn't want that to happen. Felt like it was unfair to founders. So we have principal. You're like, yeah, that's the investment amount. That just is what it is. There's interest rate. Let's do away with that. There's maturity date. Let's do away with that. So that leaves the discount and the cap. And Y Combinator said, sure, those work well, and let's make those options. They've created forms, and you can find them on their website. They're downloadable, and they work. And you can go with a discount or no discount. You can go with cap or no cap. Very simple. Stripping out the interest rate, stripping out the maturity date. Now, you'll recall our balance sheet, assets on the left, liabilities over equity on the right. When we're selling preferred shares, when we're selling stock, we're in the equity quadrant. When we're selling convertible notes, promissory notes, we're in the liability quadrant. Well, where's the safe quadrant? Well, interesting. There are only two quadrants on the right-hand side of the balance sheet. Another zero-sum game. It has to be one or the other. We know it's not debt. How do we know it's not debt? Well, because these safes don't have an interest rate and they don't have a maturity date. And those are intrinsic elements of a debt instrument. So they must be equity. Well, how are they equity? Well, a safe is a right to acquire stock. Simple agreement for future equity. There are other instruments that you may have heard of that are also a right to acquire stock. A stock option is a right to acquire stock. A warrant is a right to acquire stock. Stock options and warrants live in the equity quadrant of the balance sheet. That's where you'd book them, that's where they're situated. Same for a safe. It lives in equity. It's not literal shares quite yet, but it's situated in the equity quadrant. It is in effect a stock option. It's in effect a warrant. It is a right to acquire stock, stripped down of any complexity and made very simple. And that's the third type of deal structure. Preferred shares, convertible notes, safes. One of those three, or a combination thereof, is going to get your startup from startup to venture capital. There might be a single seed deal, one convertible note. There might be multiple seed deals. A convertible note followed by a convertible note followed by a convertible note, or a convertible note followed by a safe followed by a safe, followed by a preferred stock financing where everything converts. Like I said, every company is different. Every circumstance is different. The period of time of the seed stage is different, company to company. But these are the structures that exist. These are the options that are available. These are the choices that are available. These are the alternatives that are available to founders and investors alike in the seed stage.